So over the past couple weeks, we've been given some teasers for the upcoming Magic the Gathering set, Ikoria, Lair of Behemoths. By teasers I mean little hints, incomplete info about what's to come from the upcoming set. In this video I'll go over all the new info we have from the teasers along with my own predictions about what these teasers mean for the set. First off, for those of you who don't know, Ikoria is a set with a theme, Build Your Monster. The idea being kind of a mix between Frankenstein, Kaiju, and Pokemon to build your own giant monster just how you always dreamed. And the teasers we'll talk about today come from head Magic designer Mark Rosewater and the lead of the Ikoria Commander products, Gavin Verhey. Mark's teasers pertain to the real Ikoria set, while Gavin's teasers are about the Ikoria themed Commander products that are coming out alongside the set. So we'll talk about Mark's teasers for the Ikoria set proper first, and then afterwards we'll jump into the teasers that Gavin has given for the Commander sets that are going to come out alongside Ikoria. So for the first of Mark's teasers, there's a card in Ikoria with the text, 4 or more times this game on it. So we have some pre-existing cards in Magic that care about the number of times things have happened per game, like Once Upon a Time. And there are also some cards that care about something happening a certain amount of times per turn, like Ashling the Pilgrim. But both of these cards are pretty easy to track. They don't take much memory to keep track of how many times something has happened. Once Upon a Time only asks you to remember if it's the very first spell you played this game. And as soon as the turn ends, you can stop tracking how many times you've activated Ashling's ability. Keeping track of doing something at least 4 times over the course of a game presents some serious memory issues. So I'm pretty certain there will be some mechanic in Ikoria that will make keeping track of this a non-issue. An example of what I'm talking about is cards like Commander's Insignia. Commander's Insignia cares about how many times you cast your commander, but that's not asking the player to commit any additional memory because you already have to keep track of how many times you casted your commander for the command tax. Taking advantage of the existing commander tax ability allows them to make cards that care about how many times you casted your commander without causing any additional burden on the player's memory. So for the text 4 or more times this game to exist in the set, I think Ikoria will have some sort of mechanic that will make tracking that a non-issue. The next teaser we got was that there's a card in Ikoria with the text, total power 10 or less. We've seen cards that give you a benefit for having 10 power or greater, like Mosswort Bridge, but 10 power or less isn't really a restriction or a goal. Each player already starts the game having 10 power or less on their side of the battlefield, so there's no real work needed. So I think instead this is probably a restriction on an effect similar to Protean Hulk. Protean Hulk allows you to go grab any number of creatures as long as their converted mana cost is 6 or less, and I believe there's something similar happening with this effect. Imagine for example a mass reanimation spell that lets you pull any number of creatures out of your graveyard as long as their total power is 10 or less. Another option would be some kind of hate card, kind of like Slaughter the Strong, but the reason that I assume is probably not this is that total power 10 or less is a pretty high bar. Your opponent would have to be going pretty wide or pretty tall for the effect to not just do nothing. So yeah, my money is on some sort of Protean Hulk-esque effect with a restriction of total power 10 or less. Next, we got confirmation that Magic's largest ever power and toughness granting aura is in Ikoria. The current highest in the game is Eldrazi Conscription at +10/+10, so we know that this aura is going to be at least that much. Something that transforms a tiny little creature into a giant Godzilla monster would fit right in with Ikoria's flavor. One combo card to keep in mind with this is Storm Herald. Currently there's not a great option to take advantage of Storm Herald's ability to return auras from the graveyard directly into play in Standard, but this huge aura could be the missing piece in a sweet combo deck in Standard and in Pioneer. Next we got the teaser that there's a card in the set with the text X as the number of times that this creature has mutated. Now we don't know what mutate does yet, but we have actually seen it before on Surgeon General Commander from the recent joke set Unsanctioned. The good surgeon also cares about augmenting and putting auras on your creatures. Augmenting was a mechanic featured in some unsets where you have a host creature like this jellyfish, and you augment it by combining it with another creature. And you ended up creating a really cool combination creature, a half kitten, half jellyfish in this instance. With new stats, new abilities, new creature types, it's a pretty cool mechanic. So given that the flavor of auras and augments is bonifying your creatures, and given that, well, mutate is called mutate, I'm going to assume that mutate falls under the surgeon's purview by somehow transforming your creatures and probably giving them a new ability. And it's also noteworthy that based on this text, you can apparently mutate your creature multiple times, so it's not just like a one-time transformation like Monstrosity is. Next, it was revealed that Magic's 3rd and 4th ever cards with 0 is even in their reminder text will be in Ikoria. The 2 existing 0 is even cards are Void Winnower and Ashling's Prerogative. Both of these cards specifically care about even or odds in the context of converted mana costs. And if I were a betting man, I'd put my money on the 2 in Ikoria also caring about converted mana costs, primarily because you you just read the number to know if a converted mana cost is even or odd. There's no math, there's no counting. You just know if it's even or odd. Like, there's other cards that care about evens and odds from Magic's history, like Chaos Lord, where you would actually count the number of permanents to determine its effect. But I think we're probably going to be sticking closer to Void Winnower and Ashling's prerogative, where you just simply read a number and can determine whether it's even or odd. Something like even or odd power or even or odd toughness would also work pretty well. But all that said, there is some precedent with cards like Chaos Lords that maybe we would like count the number of counters on a creature. There's a lot of ways that can mechanically tie it to Ikoria's themes of like counters and big creatures and such. But again, my money's going to be on some sort of metric you can immediately determine without having to count or do math or anything like that. For the next teaser, it was revealed that there are 3 cards in the set with the text different names on them. So my out there guess for this teaser is that we're actually going to see more cards like Gifts Ungiven. So Gifts Ungiven is actually part of an incomplete cycle. There's gifts in blue, there's a green member of the cycle, but there's no white, red, or black members of the cycle yet. And those 3 missing colors would line up really nicely with the number of appearances of this text in Ikoria. I have a secondary reason for thinking that this Gifts Ungiven cycle might be completed in Ikoria that I'll talk about later, but for now we can just say this is an option that would fit well in this different names quota. There's also cards like Field of the Dead, which specifically want you to amass a large number of cards with different names as a challenge with a payoff. And I think specifically, having a lot of creatures with different names would make a lot of sense with Ikoria's theme. I could easily see there being a legend or some sort of faction on the plane that's passionate about wildlife diversity. That would give you some nice benefits for having a lot of different creatures with different names. And scaling back a bit, it could also just be something simpler like shared summons. But the fact that this text appears 3 times in the set makes me think it's either part of completing some cycle or part of some greater theme. Next, we got the teaser that there's a card in the set with the text remove 8 foreshadow counters on it. So to answer your question, no, foreshadow counters do not already exist in Magic the Gathering. There is actually a very old card named Foreshadow, and it's possible the counters will call back to it in some way. Perhaps the card will have some sort of ability, like every time you remove a Foreshadow counter, you get to name a card, and if it's the top card of your deck, you get some sort of benefit. But my guess is that it's something similar to Thing in the Ice. Some sort of card that starts out inert and relatively harmless, but once it's worked through all of its Foreshadow counters, it emerges as a powerful threat. So this lurking monster is being foreshadowed as appearing, and then it finally does. And one other thing to note is the fact that there's an ability to take 8 foreshadow counters off this permanent probably means it enters play with a ton of them to begin with. So I imagine working through all of them without enabling whatever this effect is that removes a ton of them at once is going to be quite a slog. And speaking of weird counters, we got confirmation that there will be 12 different types of counters in this set. So first thing to note, I'm almost certain that none of these outside of +1/+1 counters will be counters that modify power or toughness. So no +1/+2 counters, no -1/-1 counters, and etc, etc. WotC has long maintained that having +1/+1 counters and other power toughness modifying counters in the same set is way too confusing to keep track of, especially when people are generally just using dice to keep track of everything. I think it'll almost certainly be +1/+1 counters and then 11 weird counters, stuff like Scream counters from All Hallows Eve or Foreshadow counters that we were just talking about. Basically just counters you could never confuse with a +1/+1 counter. And to me, having this large number of counters actually deconfirms some mechanics, like any mechanic that relies on -1/-1 counters I think is pretty much ruled out at this point. So Infect, Persist, things like that, I don't think they'll be in this set. Again, because they don't want this conflict between +1/+1 counters and -1/-1 counters, and having that even further complicated by 11 different types of counters I'm sure is just too big of a mess. But an idea that I've heard circulating that I like the most is a mechanic similar to Recycle-a-Birds. Recycle-a-Bird is a jokey playtest card, but its ability to have counters that bestow abilities could easily be a real black border effect. Having flying counters and trample counters and haste counters and etc to bestow keyword abilities would fit perfectly with the build your monster theme of Ikoria. And if these counters were little punch outs that said flying or first strike or haste or whatever on them, those would be really easy to differentiate from each other and from +1/+1 counters, and would allow for this many counters to be in a set without causing confusion. And continuing on this counters thread, we got the teaser that there will be a card that says choose a kind of counter at random. So first off, this is definitely not just choosing any kind of counter at random from the history of Magic, there's just way too many. Again, this would work cleanest with something like Recycle-a-Bird's design. Randomly choosing between like a flying counter or a double strike counter or a death touch counter would be really interesting, and would be a really elegant way to kind of fit an enumerated list of counters into this kind of weird text structure of choose a counter at random. But another way this could work is a card like Outlaw's Merriment, where the card itself just has a preset list of counters and what they do, and then you just choose one of those at random. And the final teaser that Morrow gave us is that there's a cycle that players have been asking them to make for over 10 years. Like I mentioned mentioned before, my spicy guess for this is the completion of the Gifts Ungiven / Realms Uncharted cycle. Gifts Ungiven is from way back in Kamigawa, and Realms Uncharted is from Rise of the Eldrazi, so that fits the time frame that Morrow gave. For me, seeing a black, a red, and a white version of this effect would be really interesting, and these cards have been traditionally pretty dang powerful, so I think it'd be interesting to see. But the most popular guess I've seen online is the completion of the Ultimatum cycle. We already have all the shard colors of the Ultimatums, so for this to be true, Ikoria would have to be a wedge-colored set. That means it would focus on color combinations like white, black, green, and white, blue, red, which isn't impossible at all, but wedge and shard themed sets are few and far between, so I think it's unlikely enough to make me question the likelihood of the Ultimatum cycle actually being finished in Ikoria. But if I was a betting man and I had to put my money on a single guess, I would guess the completion of the Horizon Land cycle. Just recently in Modern Horizons, WotC made a whole enemy color half cycle of these lands. So if I had to make a guess, I would guess Ikoria is going to complete the cycle with allied color Horizon Lands. And from a financial perspective, Horizon Lands in a set basically makes it a surefire financial hit for WotC. These are just extremely powerful cards that we'll certainly see play in older formats. They would hit the time frame perfectly, people would love them, people have been asking for these for a long time. They don't have the same design restrictions as Ultimatums would, and they would make Ikoria a guaranteed smash hit, so that would be my bet. So now let's move on to the Commander teasers from Gavin. As a reminder, these teasers are about the Commander products that are going to release alongside Ikoria. These Commander products will be Ikoria themed and will share some mechanics and characters, but they're not going to be part of the actual Ikoria set, and in all likelihood, most of the cards in them will probably not be standard legal. So first up, Gavin gave us the teaser that there will be a mono white card that will be able to repeatedly ramp planes from the library directly onto the battlefield. Ramping planes isn't a new effect in white, although it's typically been either very restricted or very inefficient. But ramp and card draw are two of the most important parts of a deck in Commander, and there's things that white really can't do very well. Lacking these two things has put white at a pretty bad disadvantage in Commander, and it's made it kind of feel underpowered in the format, especially mono white. My guess would be a card similar to land tax, with the same restriction of checking each upkeep if there's an opponent with more lands than you. The main difference being that instead of pulling planes out of your deck and into your hand, this new card will put them directly onto the battlefield. That said, it probably won't cost 1 mana, and it probably won't grab 3 planes like land tax does. Land tax is kind of a messed up card. But maybe it'll just go and grab 1 planes and be more in the 3 or 4 mana range, but even that would be a really nice boon to mono white and would really help to address some of its weaknesses in the format. Next, we got the teaser that there will be a card with the text, "You and planeswalkers you control gain protection from that player." So we've seen protection from a player before with True Name Nemesis. True Name is kind of an infamous card, but that's only really in one-on-one. In multiplayer, it's much less powerful, much more balanced, because it's only really hitting on 1 opponent out of 3. But given the wording of this teaser, "You and planeswalkers you control gain protection from that player," I think it's more likely a temporary effect rather than a permanent, something like Teferi's Protection. I'm expecting some sort of get-out-of-jail-free card, where if you have an opponent that's going off and is about to kill the whole table, you can play this card and save yourself for a turn. The next teaser we got is that there's a permanent with an ability that begins with, "You may pay 0 rather than ... So one thing this brings to mind is cards like Traps, which have a reduced or sometimes free cost if your opponent blunders into them. However, cards like Traps are typically templated with a restriction at the start of the ability, such as Mindbreak Trap having, "If an opponent casts 3 or more spells this turn ... and it was specifically stated that this ability begins with "You may pay 0 rather than blank." So I think it's more in line with an ability like Thick-Skin Goblins. Thick-Skin Goblin allows you to pay 0 rather than pay the echo cost for opponents you control. This effectively means the same thing as you just don't have to pay your echo costs. And I think this teaser is alluding to the same thing. There'll be some permanent that allows you to not pay the cost of some sort of ability. My guess is it's something like, "You may pay 0 rather than pay the mutate cost for creatures you control," or, you know, any number of new or returning mechanics with built-in costs. And speaking of returning mechanics, Gavin confirmed there will be 8 named non-evergreen returning mechanics in these Commander products. And an important note he made is that these are not mechanics that are limited to what's returning in Ikoria proper, so it's not like Ikoria itself is going to have all 8 of these mechanics or vice versa. The Commander team just used whatever they felt like for these decks. But that said, he didn't explicitly say that there would be no crossover between Ikoria and these Commander sets. So I expect that the new and returning mechanics out of the Ikoria set proper will have some sort of representation in these Commander products. And these Commander products will still be Ikoria themed, so if I were to take a stab at some potential returning mechanics, I would guess something like Monstrosity, which would fit the theme of Ikoria perfectly. And two other mechanics that would fit really well with a big monster theme of Ikoria would be Ferocious and Formidable from Tarkir, both of which care about big power creatures. There's even some seeds for Ferocious currently in Standard, specifically from War of the Spark and Theros in particular, so I actually think it's pretty likely that Ferocious will return in the Ikoria set proper. Evolve, Emerge, and Devour are three other mechanics that I think would thematically fit really well in Ikoria. And Changeling would be really interesting to see it play with all these wacky creature types, and I'm sure tribal shenanigans that will feature prominently on Ikoria. And lastly, if ever there was a plane to bring back Meld, I think it would be Ikoria. So the main problem with trying to bring back Meld is that it consumes so much design space and complexity that you kinda have to throw away a whole set on it. But if they made a Meld-themed commander deck, that would be a really great way to bring back Meld as a mechanic without having to throw away like a whole set's design complexity on it. Next, we got a teaser that there will be a hound that generates fetch counters in this commander product. So I'm going to be bold and guess that this isn't just any hound, but it's actually going to be a legendary hound tribal commander to lead all the good boys in Magic the Gathering. Cats have had their time to shine in the past few years with their own commander release and their own secret layers, so I think it's only fair that dogs have their turn too. Furthermore, because there aren't a ton of hounds in the game, and because hounds aren't really exclusive to any color combinations, I think the dog will either be 5 colors, or at least have a 5-color ability to give it a color identity of all 5 colors, similar to General Tazri. This will mean you can put all the dogs of Magic in one commander deck. And next we got a teaser that there will be a card with the text whenever you cast a spell with X in its mana cost. So typically when we've seen things that care about X in mana cost, it's actually been things that hate on cards with X in their mana costs. Cards like Gaddock Teague. The only real love we've ever gotten for X-Spell Tribal has been Roshin Meander from way back in Shadow War. So it'd be really cool if one of the new Commander precons had an X-Spell Tribal theme in it. And if one does, you'll want to keep your eyes on Hydras. Not only do Hydras go great with this X-Spell Tribal theme, but on a plane like Ikoria that's all about big monsters, I'm sure it's bound to have some brand new Hydras running around. And the next teaser we got is that there'll be a reimagining of an old, popular multiplayer cycle. So to me, the fact that he specifically called out that this is a multiplayer cycle means it was either a cycle that cares about multiple opponents, or it's a cycle that originally came from a multiplayer product. The Tempting Offer cycle would be really cool to revisit. I think there's a lot of untapped potential in this mechanic, and actually, these cards are a ton of fun to play if you've ever played with them. They're really political and a ton of fun. But I'm not really sure they meet the qualification as popular. Then you have stuff like the Confluence cycle, which were certainly popular and did come from a commander set originally, but they don't really jump out as specifically a multiplayer cycle. So my personal spicy guess is actually the Primordial cycle. The Primordials are relatively old cards, they're commander staples, and their abilities specifically care about having multiple opponents. And moreover, these big primordial monsters would fit right into Ikoria's setting and flavor. So I think having a new cycle of Primordials would be really cool, really powerful, and I think would go over really well with players. Next, we got confirmation that there will be a creature in the set that generates mana that you can only use to activate abilities. So we pretty much never see abilities like this. I think Soldolvi Machinist is the only card in Magic, unless I'm missing one somewhere, that generates mana that you can only spend on a type of ability. I mean, we have cards like Castle Garenbrick that generate mana that you can either spend on a permanent or abilities of that permanent type, but just exclusively spending mana on abilities is pretty novel. To me, this jumps out and screams that there's a commander deck that's based around some sort of activated ability with a mana cost associated to it. For example, if one of the commander precons was built around Monstrosity, it would make sense to have a card like this in the deck because pretty much all of your creatures in the deck are going to have a Monstrosity ability, which means you can use this mana for those abilities. And the next feature we got is pretty exciting. It's that there'll be a single legendary creature in these commander products that will use experience counters. And as a side note, these experience counters are not one of the 8 returning named mechanics. Gavin's confirmed that. So experience counters were from way back in Commander 2015, and they were and still are very popular commanders, especially Marin and Mizzix. These commanders have traditionally proven to be very, very, very powerful build-arounds, and I expect the new legend will be probably very powerful as well. And one little piece of synergy to make note of is that even though you put the experience counters on yourself instead of on your permanents, you can still proliferate those experience counters. So all those new proliferate cards from War of the Spark will work with experience counters. And finally, between the commander products and Ikoria set proper, we've got just a ton of really wacky creature types teased, including but not limited to dinosaur cats, whale wolves, elemental otters, nightmare squirrels, and most importantly of all, the true apex predators and uncontestable kings of nature, the brushwags, make their triumphant return. But anyway, those are the Ikoria teasers we've gotten so far, along with my analysis and predictions. So what do you think? Was I close with my reads, or do you have your own predictions? Let me know. So this has been 2D. Thanks for watching.